Testing. All right. Good evening. On behalf of MTSO and the Theological Commons, our public theology initiative, I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's lecture. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Rabbi Julia Watts Belser. She's an associate professor of Jewish studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University and a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Her research centers on gender, ecology, and disability in classical Jewish literature, as well as Jewish feminist ethics. As you can see on your program, or read on your program, if you have one, she has authored 2 books, Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, soon to be out in paperback. Congratulations. And Power, Ethics, and Ecology in Jewish Late Antiquity, Rabbinic Responses to Drought and Disaster. She has held faculty fellowships at Harvard Divinity School and the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, holds leadership roles in the American Academy of Religion, serves on the faculty of the Institute for Theology and Disability, and is a crowd favorite there, from my experience. As a rabbi and a longtime advocate for disability and gender justice, she is passionate about bringing feminist, queer, and disability culture into conversation with Jewish tradition. Each time that I am able to hear Julia speak, I am inspired in unexpected ways. In the words of one of our students who was able to hear and spend time with Julia today in chapel, she said, "Julia always gives me a sense of hope." And in these times, we are grateful for the word that you bring, Julia, and how you do it. Thank you for sharing your gifts and being here with us. Please help me to welcome Julia Watts Belser.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that really generous introduction, and thank you so much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful day here with all of you. Thank you for being here tonight. So there's a couple of access copies of my talk. So if you're someone who would benefit from having a printed version of the talk, there's still a few copies available by the door. So thanks so much for having me here tonight so we can talk and think together about disability and climate change and the way that Jewish texts might help illuminate some of the questions and some of the dangers with which we're wrestling. I'd like to start tonight by laying out a problem. I want to tell you about the specific issue that's really been central to my thinking over the past few years, the fact that people with disabilities face disproportionate risks from climate change, especially from climate-intensified natural disaster. So I want to start laying out that problem, and then I'm going to turn to thinking a little bit with the texts from both Christian and especially Jewish tradition to kind of think forward about how religious resources and ethical resources might allow us to imagine a different way of moving forward. So one of the things that we know about climate change is that it intensifies our collective vulnerability to extreme weather. From devastating wildfires in Australia and California, hurricanes in Puerto Rico and the Bahamas, the Gulf Coast, and around the globe, we're seeing stronger storms and harsher impacts. One of the most pernicious effects of disaster, right, is that it often hits hardest among already marginalized communities, so that disaster ends up intensifying pre-existing inequalities. Theorist Rob Nixon says discrimination predates disaster. From poor infrastructure and fewer protective measures to assumptions that evacuation plans assume easy access to a personal car and a robust bank account, all of which make communities of color, elders, people living in poverty substantially more likely to lose their lives when disaster strikes. Disability further raises the stakes. The structural barriers that disabled people face every day, from inaccessible infrastructure, subpar public transportation systems, shoddy communication access, endemic poverty, limited voice in civic governance. All of this becomes a matter of life or death during disaster. This is, to my mind, one of the things that makes climate change so pernicious. Climate disruption will ultimately affect all of us, but certain people live closer to the storm. People of color, poor people, elders, disabled people, fat people, queer and trans people, people living under colonialism's long shadow. In short, those who already face intense structural violence are also the most vulnerable to climate disruption and the least able to mitigate its effects. Now, I've been talking about vulnerability, and I want to say a word about that because I think when we talk about vulnerability, we've got to be really, really careful. Recent media accounts have helped draw attention to the risks. We've seen stories of New Yorkers trapped in high-rise apartment buildings for days after Hurricane Sandy, nursing home residents in Florida who died from extreme heat after their institution failed to evacuate from Hurricane Irma, disaster warnings that are inaccessible to deaf communities, emergency shelters that leave wheelchair users stranded outside. But here's the problem. There's a real risk in naming vulnerability, in highlighting the particular dangers that disabled people face. All too often, the way that we think about disabled people's vulnerability during disaster and climate disruption depoliticizes the problem. It ends up making it seem inevitable that disabled people become climate casualties. Vulnerability is a dangerous business. So after a recent discussion about disability and disaster, a colleague of mine, I was giving a talk, a colleague of mine just threw up his hands and he said, it's terrible, it's really terrible. But what can you do? Some people just aren't going to make it. So once I got over my outrage, I realized that my colleague had unwittingly named a core problem facing those of us organizing for climate justice, the assumption that some people simply aren't cut out to survive. So I refuse that assumption. I dedicate this talk tonight to two disabled organizers who are doing extraordinary work for disability survival. The first is Germán Parodi, Puerto Rican co-executive director of the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. Germán is probably the first wheelchair user to deploy repeatedly to disaster-affected areas. He and his team led disability-centered disaster response in Puerto Rico and in the Bahamas. Second, Stacy Milburn, a queer Korean disability justice organizer in Oakland, California, whose Disability Justice Culture Club led grassroots emergency efforts to provide life-sustaining electricity to power-dependent individuals last summer when California's electric utility shut off power for several days as a, quote, preventative measure, without making provision for the survival of folks who rely on supplemental oxygen, CPAP machines, electric wheelchairs, anybody who needs power to live. So how we tell this story matters. If we persist in framing disability and climate change as a problem of physical vulnerability, we miss the underlying realities of structural violence. We miss seeing how ableism, racism, class inequality, and other forms of oppression work together to manufacture and compound, intensify risk. These risks, these vulnerabilities aren't simply a natural consequence of disability. They're intensified by a set of human choices, by social, structural choices to value certain kinds of bodies and minds, to build for, plan for, and prepare for certain people and leave others behind to die. So this really isn't theoretical. during Hurricane Katrina as doctors and nurses faced really terrible, brutal choices about triage. Who got left behind? Those who were judged too frail, too fat, or too disabled to save. It's so urgent that we recognize those connections, that we build solidarity among these communities to recognize and resist those kind of violence. So to understand the intersection of disability and climate change, we have to see the politics of survival that are at stake here, to recognize the way these choices are shaped by ableism. When I talk about ableism, I mean a complex set of power relations that privilege certain bodies and minds as normal, while designating other bodies as abnormal or undesirable, as well as a whole host of systems, practices, and attitudes that stigmatize disability and deny disabled people access, agency, resources, and self-determination. Ableism conspires with racism and white supremacy, with classism and capitalism, with queer and trans hatred, with ageism, with misogyny, with fat phobia, to make certain lives seem less valuable and less worthy of protection. So here's the other thing that chills me. The way our tendency to imagine disabled people as natural casualties of climate disruption aligns with eugenic logic, with fantasies about a better world, a future in which only the strong, the rich, the white, and the well-resourced are meant to survive. So it's this concern, friends, it's this concern that I want to bring tonight into conversation with ancient Jewish texts. Texts about Noah and the ark and the flood. The literary critic and environmental theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen argues that the biblical story of the flood, with its tiny little ark and a handful of chosen survivors, is a really dangerous cultural template. One that inscribes the inevitability of deluge and disaster. One that imagines the ark as the only route to survival. What if, Cohen asks, what if we stopped using the flood as our unspoken cognitive frame for thinking about climate change? Or, at the very least, what if we stopped playing the role of Noah, content to save only a small chosen community when the storm comes? What if we prepared instead collectively for cataclysm, in which we do not leave those outside our walls to drown? Cohen's question echoes for me powerfully within Jewish tradition, which has long had a quite ambivalent embrace of Noah. While the biblical text imagines Noah as a righteous man who, quote, found favor with God, the rabbis actually offer a much more hesitant portrait of Noah. They're disapproving of his silence. They're very concerned about his quick compliance when God decreed the earth's destruction, right? They think he should have protested a bit more and not been quite so ready to build that ark. So tonight, I want to talk through Jewish traditions about Noah and the ark, tales that grapple more explicitly with the politics of survival. So I'll be focusing mostly tonight on rabbinic stories, stories that expand and embellish upon biblical traditions. These are stories that circulated widely in Jewish late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and that continue to be told and retold today. I want to be clear that I don't actually think these texts hold pragmatic solutions when it comes to climate disruption. As you see, I'm actually often quite critical of some of their assumptions. But I also find these ancient Jewish stories to be a really powerful and potent site for grappling with the ethical questions that climate change poses. So let's think together a little bit about images that come to mind when we think about Noah and the ark. In contemporary American culture, Noah's Ark has often been told as a children's story, with all the animals lined up neatly 2 by 2. But shift the frame. Shift the frame, and the ark becomes the original story of a gated community. A story about a handful of privileged survivors who stay snug in their boat while the rest of the world drowns. This is the question that haunts me in the Noah tale. This question of how a rosy narrative of the survival of a few gets laid over top a watery grave. When modern Jewish communities read Noah's story today, our eye is often trained toward the rainbow, toward the promise that comes after the flood. But I have to tell you, I am really distrustful of that impulse in this moment. I am distrustful of the way we all too easily efface the casualties and the memory of those who do not survive. Thank you. So let me offer us a different image. The painting attributed to the Spanish master Francisco Goya, an image known as the dog. A dog drowning in quicksand, its gray head poking defiantly out of the brown sludge toward a dead yellow sky. When I hear the story of the flood, I cannot take my eyes away from Goya's dog. My heart is with the lost, the left behind, with the ones who drowned. So let me tell you a story from the Talmud, a story from the ancient Jewish text, 4th and 5th century Babylonia, a story that I think points toward this recognition, that grapples with the problem of who got left behind and why. I want to warn you at the outset that this is a difficult story, a story that I actually find quite toxic for the way that it stigmatizes survivors of sexual violence. So I just want to give you a heads up there. But I tell this story because I think it is also an important story, a story that makes visible a bitter cultural truth, a story that we need to think about together, a story about bodies that are stigmatized and despised. So the Talmud asks, how'd they choose the animals to take on board the ark? How'd they single out the ones who would survive? To answer that question, one of the rabbis, Shmuel bar Nachmani, picks up a strange detail in the biblical text. It's when Noah is instructed to take 7 animal pairs, ish and ishto. The Hebrew there is literally husbands and their wives. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani asks, why does the text say of animals, take 7 husbands and wives? Isn't marriage an institution reserved only for humankind? So ultimately, the rabbi argues that the chosen animals are those who comported themselves like proper married couples. That is to say, they've never been involved in sexual transgression. You can see how Shmuel and Nachmani and I are not entirely on the same page here. There's a widespread motif in early Jewish thought that the earth before the flood was full of sexual sin, that humans engaged with sex with animals, violating the moral lines that are supposed to distinguish between different species and kinds. So Shmuel's saying here that when it comes to selecting animals to survive the flood, the ark accepts only those who are properly mated. Shmuel doesn't want any trace of sexual impropriety to enter the ark or to come into the new-made world. Now, as a feminist reader, as a queer reader, as a reader attuned to the realities of sexual violence, I know this kind of thinking all too well. I know how notions of sexual purity get deployed to paint certain peoples and certain bodies as disposable, as refuse, as nothing more than trash. So our text goes on. How did Noah know? Rav Chisda said, oh, he passed the animals before the ark, and all that the ark accepted, it was known that a sin had been done with them. And those that the ark did not accept, well, a sin had been done to them. According to this tradition, Noah passes the animals before the ark, and the ark itself becomes a moral arbiter, accepting some and turning others away. So I got to tell you, every time I prepare to give a talk about the flood, I ask myself, should I snip this text out? Because every time I talk about this text, it just feels like a shaft to the heart. But I believe we've got to talk about this text because it names a perverse tendency, not just in the Talmud, but in many traditions and also in our own contemporary moment. This tradition makes manifest the exclusions of sanctuary, the way refuge is bought for a few at the expense of other bodies, bodies deemed too unsavory, too ugly, too disabled, too fat, too poor, too brown to save. In this moment, the Talmud's ark offers a profoundly conditional refuge. It offers sanctuary only for a tiny group of chosen few. So here's the question I think we've got to ask ourselves. Is this the limit of our refuge dreams? Is this the only way we can imagine sanctuary and survival? Can we not do better? The work I do on disability and climate change is dedicated to forging a different answer. So I want to tell you two other stories now, stories in which the Talmud resists this tendency, stories in which Jewish texts imagine a different kind of sanctuary. So let's consider a tradition from the Babylonian Talmud, a tradition that considers how the mythical creature known as the Re'em survived the flood. So scholars suggest that the Re'em might be a reference to the aurochs, an ancient species of cattle memorialized in prehistoric cave paintings. But Jewish tradition gives us a different story. Jewish tradition says the Re'em is the unicorn. Now, in contrast to the popular song where the unicorn gets left behind when the flood comes because it's playing games and splashing in the rain, the Talmud gives a different account. The Talmud takes for granted that the Re'em survives. The question they ask is, how? How? The Talmud describes the Re'em, or in Aramaic, the Rema, as an enormous creature. Rabbi Rabba Bar Chana says he once saw a day-old child of the Re'em, and it was as large as Mount Tabor, 40 parsangs long. Now, you may not know what a parsang is. Right? Modern commentators disagree on the precise measure. Many suggest each parsang is about 2.5 miles. So suffice it to say, a newborn Re'em is not likely to fit in my apartment, right? Or probably even your houses. Right? It certainly would have posed quite a challenge to bring her onto the ark. Her neck alone, Rabbi Bar Chana says, is 3 parsangs long. And when she excretes, her poop is big enough to dam up the River Jordan. So I love this story as a way for thinking about disability in the flood, because this is a story that makes plain the problem of access. This is a story about a body that does not fit in conventional space, a body who exceeds the expected boundaries, a body for whom accommodations must be devised. So the rabbis lay out a number of possibilities. Perhaps they tied her horn to the ark, so the ark was like a giant piece of driftwood that she could float beside. Maybe she just rested only the very tip of her nose on the deck, just enough to let her breathe. Right? And when the Talmud raises an objection that maybe the floodwaters were boiling hot, surely the Rema couldn't have survived like this, the text suggests a miracle was performed for her. A little bubble of cool, still water surrounded the ark for the express purpose of letting the unicorn survive. This is a moment of what I like to call divine accommodation, this little portable bubble sanctuary that surrounds the big, beautiful body of the Rema in the midst of the raging flood and keeps her safe through the storm. Now, I want to be clear. As much as I love this story, I don't think we can lift this story up as somehow solving the ethical problems raised by the flood or the dangers posed by this fantasy of celebrating a small group of elite survivors. I tell this story today because I hear in it the reminder that ancient Jewish rabbis were grappling with the problem of exclusion, the problem of access. I hear in it a recognition of, an empathy with the bodies that don't fit on the ark, the bodies who have no refuge, the bodies who otherwise can't make it to sanctuary. The tellers of our tale want the Re'em, this big, beautiful, fat, queer, crip creature. They want her to survive. So I also don't want to make too much of this whimsical moment, though. There's something perverse about celebrating the survival of a mythical unicorn in a time when so many people cannot find refuge, when so many bodies are shut out of sanctuary and are left to die without shelter and without rescue. Our story suggests that the Re'em's survival was a confluence of human ingenuity and divine intervention. But I'm mindful of the Talmud's insistence that it is forbidden to rely upon a miracle. The Talmud teaches that Jews are not allowed to put our faith in collective faith in this kind of divine intervention. Faced with a rickety bridge or an unstable wall, the Talmud says we have a collective responsibility to change the situations that might require divine rescue. Great, there we go. And not simply put our trust in good fortune or in God. So to think more about this collective responsibility to change the circumstances, right, that might require a miracle, I want to tell you one more story about the Talmud. It's a story about another unexpected survivor, the biblical King Og, ruler of Bashan. So, according to rabbinic and medieval Jewish traditions, Og was a man of extraordinary stature. He was one of the primordial giants, one of the Bnei Elohim, the only one, in fact, who survived the flood. So a midrash in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer lays out how this happens. According to our midrash, whoops, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. Well, according to our midrash, Og sat on a piece of wood that extended from one of the gutters that leads out of the ark. There's an entire drainage and plumbing system that's imagined here, right? I won't go into its details. But Og, it seems, was tall enough that he could sit at the bottom of the ark and still keep his head above the waves. But the problem he faces, according to our midrash, is how's he going to find sufficient food during the duration of the flood? He's got a good seat, but what's the man going to eat? So it's Noah who saves him. Og swears fealty, and Noah bores a hole into the side of the boat. Noah brings Og food every day and every night, and so too Og survives. I am struck by the risk here. The fact that making a hole in the ark in the midst of a flood might well have intensified the danger for those already on board. I wonder, were there those on board who counseled Noah not to risk it? Not to make a breach in their tidy little boat? not to think beyond their walls, not to worry about those outside. But our Midrash imagines Noah as breaking the boundaries of the ark, deliberately refusing to police those borders. It's a striking act, especially because the Midrash imagines God as sealing the borders of the ark with God's own hand. Like the tradition in the Talmud that I mentioned earlier, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer's God is engaged here in a kind of moral improvement scheme, using the flood to increase the number of pure creatures and decrease the number of impure ones. I got to say, this is not the God that I'm opting with, right? So according to this schema, the ones on the outside are supposed to die. They are supposed to be washed away so that everything can be clean and new and beautiful. I just want to say again, quite plainly, I reject Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer's vision of God. I don't believe in a God who orchestrates catastrophe or climate change, a God who sides with genocide or who decides to condemn all us creatures, humans and hedgehogs and caterpillars and oak trees, to sudden terrible death so the world can get a fresh new start. When catastrophe comes, the God I love, the God I know, is right in our midst, binding up as best she can the shattered pieces. The God I love is the one who strengthens the rescuers, the one who hands out masks to folks living unhoused on smoky streets, the one who organizes backup batteries for disabled people who need oxygen and electric wheelchairs. The God I love is the one who wants Noah to bust through that walled sanctuary and share his family's food with those who are closer to the storm. Noah is an ambivalent character in the Jewish imagination precisely because in most accounts of the flood story, Noah fails to take this kind of action. Noah's portrayal in this midrash that I mentioned is actually totally unusual. Okay? The biblical Noah, for example, seems entirely unconcerned when God tells him about the plan to destroy the earth. That silence leads the rabbis to express serious moral reservations about Noah's character. While the Bible describes Noah as a righteous man, the rabbis give a much more hesitant portrait. They side not with Noah, but with Abraham, the one who protested on behalf of Sodom, the one who asked of God, "Shall not the judge of all the earth act justly? How, God? How can you condemn them all to die?" So let me close tonight with a passage from the Zohar, one that imagines God's response when Noah emerges from the ark. In this moment, Noah sees the devastation and begins to weep. And Noah says, "God, you are called the master of compassion. Why didn't you have compassion for your creation?" God isn't moved by Noah's critique. God asks, "Now you plead on their behalf. I lingered with you and spoke to you at length so that you might ask for mercy for the world. But as soon as you heard that you would be safe in that ark, the evil of the world did not touch your heart. You built that ark and saved yourself." When I read Noah today, when I linger with these ancient Jewish texts, this is what I want for all of us, that we resist the lure of the closed community, that tiny little sanctuary floating above the flood, that we commit ourselves to work not just for personal sanctuary, but for a world where all of us survive. Thank you.
We do have time for questions, so just raise your hand and make sure you use the mic. comments?
We've had earlier conversation, but in talking with class last night, I presented a story that Douglas Rushkoff posted a couple times last year about tech millionaires. Speaking with him about what climate change would mean, and one of their primary questions was how to control their private army and their security forces in the midst of devastation. And I think about what you're calling for us for is a witness of faith.
That's right.
In a very remarkable way, where many folks who are even supporting the denial of this financially are preparing their own little arcs.
Yeah. You know, I think that it is for me such a commitment around faith, such a commitment to want to say it is not enough to only think about me and mine. I understand that impulse. I actually think that the impulse to want to protect ourselves and our loved ones, right, is an impulse into which we should tap, right? Because that impulse, that moment when we realize that risk is not just happening to other people, but also coming for us, right? This is actually a very powerful catalyst moment. The key thing, though, as I understand it, is to take that catalyst moment, right, and then also commit to thinking outwards, right? To not think about building the resources, right, so they only go towards strengthening personal walls, right? But in that moment, to let the catalyst, right, move us toward a different kind of vision and commitment to shared collective concern. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. When I took Professor Kim's Hebrew Bible class, he, of course, had us read the big prophets.
Yes.
And I was so taken with Amos, who had this invocation that he said repeatedly, and I can't remember it exactly, but it was basically, wake up, you guys. You're wrong. Bad things are going to happen. And I think that we need our Amos today. And one of the people that strikes me as having these characteristics is Greta Thunberg. A 16-year-old child took off from school and said, "This is wrong.
Yeah.
How dare you?"
Yeah.
And that was her tagline. And you know, if it takes a 16-year-old child to wake up the sleeping masses so that we can think about other people, we're in trouble, but at least we have that voice.
Yeah, so there's actually a rabbinic tradition that suggests that prophecy post-destruction of the temple, that prophecy emerges particularly powerfully from the voices of children, right? And from those who are deemed mad. Right? And I use that term mad in the disability pride, in the mad pride sense, right? To recognize the way in which sometimes some of the most powerful witness that we have comes from those who are not always well esteemed. Right? But I also want to suggest that I think one of the things that's really important for us in these days is that we also cultivate ways to, like, on the one hand, wake up, that kind of exhortation, and on the other hand, strategies and resourcefulness for extraordinary gentleness, right? Because doing this work, waking up to this work, is also really hard, right? It's heartbreaking, actually. And so I think that actually alongside the exhortation, it's been really important to me to think about the strategies that we might use to help the waking heart stay open, right? And to not flinch back from pain, right? Because I think I'm really moved actually by the work of sociologist Carrie Marie Norgaard, who writes, whose work on climate change denial suggests that actually she's working particularly, her work comes particularly out of a Norwegian context, right? but that in her experience, ethnographic work suggests that sometimes the tendency to want to look away from climate change comes not out of a sort of lack of concern, but actually a tremendous amount of empathy, a recognition that it's actually so hard and sad to look at, right? That often we don't want to look at it, right? So that this has actually really led me to try and think about ways to take a both-and approach. Yes, the exhortation, but also that question of how do we strengthen our capacity to work deeply, to recognize and speak to each other's grief and fear, right? While also trying to do that work of recognizing climate injustice, grappling with privilege, dealing with inequality, right? That to me feels to be one of the most important things. This is another place actually where I think religious communities may be particularly well suited to be able to tap into some of the resources, right, that religious communities have for helping communities think about how to do that difficult work.
Do you know of any particular midrash or whether it be just any type of sacred text that talks about Noah's wife and her role as it relates to possibly Noah's change of heart or how he built the ark or even when he made the provisions for the king of Bashan?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
is
such
there
an
anything?
interesting question, right? I really appreciate your mentioning that. There is a moment when I think actually in many of there are some traditions about Noah's wife, but in the text that I have worked most closely with, right, the text actually focuses primarily on Noah and Noah's sons. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that text in particular uses a lot of maternal imagery, right, to describe Noah and the extraordinary work of feeding and tending and caring for the animals on the ark, right? So there's almost a kind of Noah, a sort of mothering image of Noah as a provider. Noah's son is like, look, this was really a bad gig on the ark. I'm not recommending it to you. He is really suggesting that, Dad had no end of trouble. So it's a moment, I think, that in some ways, I read that as a text that is, when I read that text, especially as a feminist reader, I think about the absence, right? Her absence, right? And so I want to mark that absence while also recognizing that it's possible that the text is kind of gesturing to traditions of care and of mothering, right? Even though it hasn't quite wrapped its head around doing that with actual embodied women in this instance, right? So it's a really lovely question that you've asked. Yeah, thank you.
Just to expound upon that a little bit, even when reading further and looking at different marital traditions and how Noah's sons and their wives were on the ark. And so what then does that bring into the narrative as it relates to choice?
Right.
Because traditionally, the wives of Noah's sons may have been forced to go on the ark, although of course it was safety, so they probably didn't have to force them. But what
They're probably ready to go.
Right,
They're
they
probably
were ready to go.
Right?
But what conversations does that start surrounding agency and things of that nature?
Beautiful, really good question. So there's actually another rabbinic tradition that suggests that there was no sex happening on the ark. That basically, right, which I tend to read as a moment of thinking also about women's agency. I'm not sure that the Talmud is necessarily thinking about it immediately in those terms, but I feel like the reading is really potentially there. That tradition actually is the idea that in a time of communal crisis, right, one wants to think really carefully about bringing new life into the world, right? And so this is actually a very powerful question about women's reproductive agency and the kind of intentional thinking that a community or that couples might undertake together about, is this our moment, right? Is this our time? Are we ready, in fact, to bring to bring children into this particular world. So one of the rabbinic traditions, there's a lot of different, sometimes competing rabbinic traditions. So there's not really a single voice going on here, but that's one that I think speaks in some ways to what you're suggesting.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your reading. I have a class in here that I'm sure we're going to have a lively conversation about all of this next week. I have two questions. They are not related, but I want to get them both out of the way, and you can answer them. The first is about the agency of the ark.
Yeah.
The moral agency of the ark. And I wonder, and part of what it's making me think about is what constitutes as living in the mind of the rabbis, in the Talmud
exactly.
and beyond. Because that's a living kind of thing. So
Actually, can we pause there? And I swear
Yes,
we'll come back to your
okay.
second question, because I don't want to forget the thread, right? At this point in the evening, I don't want to risk missing the thread. So actually, you hold on to the mic. Keep that mic. I remember as a little kid having in elementary school having a real fight with a teacher. I was a super compliant kid, so this was not a particularly commonplace experience. But they tried to tell me that rocks were not alive. And I just knew it was not true. Right? And eventually I was like, all right, fine, I concede your point. Right? I know you're wrong, right? But I'm just going to agree that this is the world we're working in. Right? And so actually I think many rabbinic traditions live in a world that is much more animated, right? Mm-hmm. Much more animate than many of us today. And I think this is also really culturally specific, right? So I want to just say sort of the dominant, especially white Euro culture, tends to be really, really thin in terms of thinking about animacy. And my own lived experience, my own sense of being in the world has just a much wider understanding of animacy. Rabbinic tradition, I didn't know at the time, right? But rabbinic tradition, including some of the great Jewish rationalists, right, attributed rocks and stones with agency. They're called the domem, the silent ones, right? But just because you're silent doesn't mean you're not alive, right? So it's not speech, right, that makes that magic happen. Right? So I think that sense of this whole other tradition of recognizing the agency, the animacy, the liveliness of other beings and creatures, including things that dominant culture often imagines as stuff, right? Inanimate matter, right? Is a powerful resource in Jewish tradition, and it's a place where I think there's also some really powerful connections with a lot of indigenous and other modes of thinking about the world. So your second question.
So I'm actually going to be thinking about that a lot, because for a lot of reasons. But the other one was when you made reference to the horror that was. We often talk about Katrina, but we don't think about Rita and Wilma.
Yeah.
There were three
That's
hurricanes,
right. Yeah.
We say Katrina, but it
Yeah.
literally was 3 hurricanes and then the flooding and all of that. But when you were talking about, I remember how horrified I was about the triaging at Tulane Hospital.
Yeah,
I guess I want you to reflect with us around a different kind of triaging that might be possible, that is more equitable and more ethical and more sane. Sane.
Yeah. So this is a moment where I go back to Rob Nixon's recognition, right? That so in this moment, then President George W. Bush said the storm did not discriminate, and neither did the recovery effort, right? I think both aspects of that statement were manifestly untrue, right? We know it for sure about the recovery effort, right? But I think it's also important to recognize the way in which, thinking here with Nixon's recognition, that discrimination on the part of the storm predates the hurricane. So I want to even back the question up about triage, because we gotta think about trying to avoid a situation, right, where those kind of, and I want to recognize that though I think there was some choices made that were brutal and criminal, I also want to recognize that many good-hearted people were facing extraordinary, inconceivably difficult choices, right? So I want to be clear about that. And that's where I think we need to think way before a storm if we want to be able to have a different conversation about outcomes, right? Because once the forecast is in place, right, there are still things you can do, right? But your choices are so much more limited, right? This is also why it helps to think about this as early as possible, right? Because we have a wider palette of options to work with, so our choices become less bad, right? I think that to me is one of the most important considerations. I think one of the other things that's really on my mind there about that is that so often disaster response presumes a kind of individual, like a sort of rescue yourself model, right? That's right. So for example, in the recent power outages in California, the city of Berkeley at one point, after facing a lot of outcry from disability communities, the city of Berkeley tweeted, if you're power dependent, right, we urge you to evacuate to another area using your own personal resources. Well, friends, I mean, that's just an idea that's pretty out of touch. So it's to avoid that kind of ludicrous response, we got to think really differently also about how, right? I firmly believe that if the prototypical person who we thought about as needing to evacuate was a disabled person who was a parent and primary caretaker of kids, who had a limited income and no car. If we use that as our baseline, we would think in really different ways about how to get people out of trouble. The other thing is, it's not enough to just pluck people out of a dangerous situation, right? One of the reasons it's so hard, you end up breaking people's support networks, right? And so in many cases, those support networks are the way that kids get taken care of, the way people understand that their disability needs are going to be taken care of, right? So that is also another thing that really needs to get thought about more when we're thinking about, taking a really different approach to questions about triage. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. So this discussion of Noah's Ark has me thinking about other biblical narratives of selective rescue.
Yeah.
Such as Lot and his family being delivered from Sodom and Gomorrah, or even Rahab and her folks being saved in the midst of Jericho's destruction.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear how your reading of Noah's Ark might inflect those other stories as well.
That's right. So if I wanted to, on one wheel here, give you my reading of the story of Lot, right? I would say that the hero in that story for me is Lot's wife, who looks back, right? The one who says, wait, but what about the people and the place that we're leaving behind, right? That's another powerful moment of limited agency, right? We don't want to overplay the degree of agency she has. That train is leaving, right? They are going, and the choice does not seem to be available to her to stay, to resist, to rewrite the narrative. Right? But I read that moment in which she turns back and literally becomes the embodied pillar of salt land, right? Of land that can no longer bear. As a moment of, resistance to that idea of individual, personal rescue. Right? Again, my God kind of lingers with her. I think I just often, I find some of my most life-giving readings of biblical narrative when I don't assume that the role of God as written is necessarily the only option available to us. I just find that sometimes it's helpful to sort of think about other possibilities in terms of where God might be in this text.
I want to continue with the thread the two doctors started. So you were talking about how the rabbis thought that Noah should have pushed back. So the immediate question that came to mind is, have any of them thought about, well, what should Noah have done instead? If Noah had pushed back, what would have happened? And then the follow-on would be, when we look at climate change writ large, or smaller disasters, wildland, woodland interface fires, and so on, what does that look like applying that to today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the paradigmatic example that the rabbis give of what to do is to take the Abraham role, right? To do the thing that Abraham does in the Sodom story, which I mentioned in my talk, which is a pretty chutzpahdik maneuver, right? Abraham says to God, what are you doing here? You're shofet kol haaretz, you're the judge of all the earth, and yet you're not going to act with justice. I mean, it's a pretty bold, I tell my students, I read that to my students, their biblical literacy is not super high, and they're like, whoa, that's in the text as written? So, I think, I'm like, it is in there, it's right in there. And Jewish tradition really appreciates that and resonates a lot with that idea of the kind of holy argument, which I read as calling God to God's better nature, right? Saying, God, actually, I know that this is not who you are, right? This is not what you do. What's going on here, right? And so that feels to me a really powerful moment of, and I think that is, what do I know? But if I were imagining, they don't really play this out fully, right? Later rabbinic traditions, early modern traditions will begin to make that kind of Abraham-Noah contrast more explicitly. The Zohar, actually, the medieval text that I quoted, will do a little bit with the juxtaposition between Abraham and Noah as well. So I do think that Abraham is kind of a foil for Noah. Noah, be like our guy. Do that. Push back a little more. Argue a little. Don't just say, okay, sure, fine, I'll build your ark, how high, I'm not actually sure that this is a super helpful paradigm for thinking about our own response to climate change, though, because I actually think we get into trouble when we stick God into the narrative here. So I'm not entirely convinced that that's an easy to apply parallel, because most of the sort of, again, kind of dominant frames for putting God in the climate change narrative end up doing things that I think are theologically really problematic is the word I'll go with, right, in this moment. So that we end up either with a kind of theology of God as responsible for cataclysm, or a God who's somehow indifferent. So I don't actually think I just don't think it's helpful to go there. And that's partly why when I talk about these kind of stories, I try to be really explicit about what I think the role that I see God playing in this actual, right, in the situation in which we find ourselves, right? I mean, I see that role being played by the kind of work, the inspiration, the drive, the grit that leads people like my friend Herman Parodi, to do the kind of disability-centered disaster work, that leads Stacy Wilburn to do organizing around power. if I want to identify where God is in this lovely, beautiful, but also really hard mess, I think God is the push, the propulsion to do that kind of work. And that's what I want to see more of us doing. Actually, I think that, I'm all for theological reflection, but I'm also for figuring out local ways to begin building those kind of community resilience networks. I think that matters. And if we could divert, just tithe a little portion of the energy you spend, doing book theology and give it to that would be really, in my book, that'd be really, really right on.